Today's stories plunge us into the depths of true crime. We start with a chilling case of a mother accused of a horrifying act against her own child. Then, we unravel the mystery and controversy surrounding a tragic death that shocked everyone. Finally, we delve into the dark tale of a man convicted of a dreadful crime against his family. But before we get into these gripping stories, if you're a fan of the darkest true crime stories delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do. Please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On a warm, seemingly ordinary summer day in 2008, Caylee Anthony's voice broke the calm over the 911 line, her words laced with a panic that would soon captivate the entire nation. "I found my daughter's car today, and it smells like there's been a dead body in it." She was calling to report that her granddaughter, Caylee Anthony, had been missing for 31 days. With each question from the dispatcher, Cindy's anxiety grew, but what became immediately clear to those listening was that something deeply troubling was amiss in the Anthony family's Orlando, Florida home. The investigation began quickly, and detectives arrived at the house where Cindy's daughter, Caylee Anthony, stood by, seemingly unfazed. As authorities began piecing together details from Cindy, Caylee, and other family members, a troubling picture began to emerge. The investigators were left to wonder, how had a mother gone over a month without reporting her child missing? And why did the details from Caylee Anthony, Caylee's 22-year-old mother, seem so hazy and contradictory? From the very beginning, Caylee's account of what had happened to her daughter didn't sit well with investigators. At first, she claimed that Caylee had been taken by her nanny, a woman named Zenaida Gonzalez. Caylee said that Zenaida had picked Caylee up one day and simply vanished, taking her without any explanation. Yet, as officers followed the leads Caylee provided, they discovered that the so-called Zanny the nanny didn't seem to exist, at least not in the way Caylee described. Zenaida Gonzalez was a real person, but she had no connection to Caylee Anthony. Detectives quickly began to question whether Caylee was telling them the full story, or indeed any part of the truth. As more information surfaced, it became clear that Caylee's behavior in the weeks after Caylee's disappearance was far from what most would expect from a grieving or worried mother. In the days following the last time Caylee was seen, Caylee had gone shopping, attended parties, and even got a tattoo that read Bella Vita, meaning beautiful life in Italian. These actions painted a portrait of a woman unconcerned about her daughter's well-being. She seemed detached, even indifferent, while her child was missing. Friends and acquaintances who saw Caylee during this time would later testify that she appeared carefree, never mentioning Caylee's disappearance or showing signs of distress. By now, Caylee's shifting story and strange demeanor were raising suspicions among law enforcement and the public. Police brought Caylee in for questioning, hoping that more direct interrogation would yield the truth. Yet, Caylee's lies continued to mount. When questioned, she described specific places she and Caylee had been together, people she had talked to, and activities they had done. Yet, with every new detail, Caylee's story unraveled even further. Surveillance footage, phone records, and witness testimonies directly contradicted nearly everything she told the police. This wasn't a case of a mother too traumatized to tell a coherent story. This was something else entirely. Soon, evidence emerged that pointed to something darker. Detectives located Caylee's abandoned white Pontiac Sunfire, and inside was an unmistakable odor, one that officers would later say they recognized as the distinct smell of decomposition. Alongside this, investigators found traces of a substance that resembled human decomposition fluids and unusual levels of chloroform residue. The trunk, they believed, held secrets to what had truly happened to Caylee. At this point, the case had taken on a life of its own. Media outlets began covering the story extensively, and the public was both horrified and mesmerized. How could a young mother be so evasive about the disappearance of her own child? Speculation ran rampant, with many condemning Caylee as someone incapable of caring for her daughter. The Anthony family home was surrounded by cameras and news vans, and nearly every detail of the investigation was dissected in the court of public opinion. To the world, it seemed that this young mother's story was filled with deception, and as more details came to light, the nation was captivated. Despite the media storm, the authorities focused on piecing together every scrap of information. The forensic team examined Casey's computer and discovered a troubling search history that included terms like chloroform and foolproof suffocation. The searches seemed planned and calculated, not the actions of a panicked parent looking for a missing child. These revelations strengthened the case against Casey, and the police believed they were inching closer to the truth of what had happened to Caylee. Family members were also caught in this storm of doubt and suspicion. Cindy and George Anthony faced relentless scrutiny, their personal lives on display as they grappled with their daughter's behavior and the potential loss of their granddaughter. Interviews with Casey's parents revealed a complex dynamic within the Anthony family. Cindy, who had initially called 911 and raised the alarm about Caylee's disappearance, now found herself in a terrible bind, caught between a daughter who refused to tell the truth and a granddaughter who was still missing. George Anthony, Casey's father, was equally distressed. He tried to cooperate with law enforcement, but found himself wrestling with the media's relentless questions and the painful suspicions surrounding his own daughter. As detectives continued to search for Caylee, they eventually received a tip that would change the direction of their investigation. A utility worker named Roy Kronk had discovered a suspicious bag in a wooded area near the Anthony family's home. The area had flooded during Florida's rainy season, so it was easy to miss evidence among the overgrown vegetation. But in December 2008, Kronk's discovery would finally bring the devastating confirmation that investigators and the public had feared. Inside the bag, investigators found skeletal remains that would later be confirmed as Caylee's. The remains were found with remnants of clothing and a blanket, items that seemed to link directly back to the little girl. Though severely decomposed, the tiny bones told a story of innocence lost, and a search that had come to a tragic end. Forensic experts were immediately called to the scene where Caylee's remains had been found, and it wasn't long before they began carefully gathering evidence that could help reconstruct the events leading to her tragic end. Analysts cataloged every item found in the bag, documenting each piece of fabric, each small bone, and any other traceable items. Among them, they found a heart-shaped sticker, a small yet chilling detail that felt both tender and unsettling. It suggested that someone might have placed it there with care, an action that contradicted the otherwise heartless abandonment of the child's body in the dense Florida woods. Meanwhile, back in the lab, forensic specialists were analyzing items collected from Casey's car, including strands of hair, traces of chloroform, and even microscopic evidence that could reveal what happened in the weeks before Caylee's disappearance was reported. As investigators compared samples from the car to those found with Caylee's remains, a clearer picture began to form. Hair samples recovered from Casey's trunk appeared to belong to Caylee and showed signs consistent with post-mortem changes, suggesting Caylee had likely been in the car after her passing. This revelation added a disturbing layer to the timeline, indicating that the story Casey told detectives about Caylee's whereabouts was far from the truth. Investigators also took a closer look at Casey's online search history, where they discovered specific searches related to how to make chloroform and household weapons. The searches were alarming on their own, but what made them even more troubling was their timing. These searches occurred just days before Caylee was last seen. Though the searches were circumstantial evidence, they painted a disturbing picture of a mother seemingly researching harmful methods before her daughter's disappearance. This was not the profile of a parent concerned for their child's safety. It was something far darker. The media picked up on every new piece of evidence, each revelation more shocking than the last, and the public's reaction was fierce. News anchors, commentators, and everyday viewers dissected every detail of the investigation. While the prosecution was building its case, the world was forming its opinions. Caylee Anthony became a household name, and the public's perception of her was largely unforgiving. Many saw her as a person who lacked the natural instincts of a caring parent. But beyond the sensational headlines, the prosecution had the daunting task of proving Casey's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. With evidence piling up, the case was soon prepared for trial. It became one of the most anticipated trials in recent memory, and both sides prepared meticulously. Prosecutors aimed to illustrate a sequence of events that could establish Casey's involvement in Caylee's disappearance, while Casey's defense team devised a plan that would shock everyone in the courtroom. When the trial finally began, the prosecution started by introducing the physical evidence found with Caylee's remains and from Casey's car, setting the stage for a compelling and tragic narrative. In contrast, the defense's opening statement seemed almost unimaginable to those who had followed the case closely. Casey's attorney argued that Caylee had not been harmed by Casey at all, but had accidentally lost her life in the family pool. According to the defense, Caylee's accidental passing had triggered a panic within the Anthony family, especially for George Anthony, Casey's father, who they claimed was involved in the subsequent cover-up. The defense also suggested that George had a history of intimidating Casey into silence, creating an atmosphere in which she felt she could not tell the truth. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as these accusations unfolded, introducing a shocking new angle to the already bewildering case. The prosecution, however, continued to focus on the incriminating digital evidence, such as the chloroform searches and the presence of decomposition chemicals in Casey's trunk. They called forensic experts to testify about the trunk's unusual odor and the potential causes of the chemical traces found there. Though the defense sought to cast doubt on these findings by questioning the reliability of odor-based evidence, the prosecution remained steadfast, asserting that the evidence indicated a disturbing sequence of events that didn't align with an accidental passing. The courtroom atmosphere was tense, with emotions running high as both sides presented their cases. Witnesses from Casey's social circle took the stand, describing her demeanor in the days after Caylee's disappearance. Many recounted seeing Casey acting carefree, attending parties, and shopping. Prosecutors pointed to these actions as proof of Casey's indifference, arguing that a grieving mother wouldn't be so detached. The defense countered by explaining that this behavior was a coping mechanism, an attempt by Casey to mask her pain. Yet, for many in the courtroom, this explanation felt hollow. As witness after witness shared their accounts, the tension only increased. Friends, family members, and experts were called to testify, each adding pieces to the puzzle, and it was clear that this case had struck a deeply personal chord with the public. By now, nearly everyone following the trial had their own theory about what happened, and each testimony seemed to either strengthen or shatter those beliefs. The courtroom was filled with intense scrutiny as both the prosecution and defense fought to shape the narrative surrounding Caylee's passing. As the trial continued, the prosecution introduced some of its most impactful evidence. They called expert witnesses in forensic science to explain the implications of the chemical compounds found in Casey's car trunk. These witnesses testified about the unusual levels of chloroform detected in the trunk, a substance found in traces associated with decomposition. The prosecution's experts used scientific analysis to strengthen their argument, claiming these traces indicated the presence of human decomposition. They described how these findings weren't ordinary, painting a grim picture of what might have taken place. While the defense fought to cast doubt on these scientific conclusions, arguing that the results could be explained by common household products, the prosecution pressed forward, determined to tie every thread back to Casey's behavior and digital trail. At this point, the prosecution also presented a psychological angle. They called a series of witnesses to testify about Casey's actions and apparent detachment in the days and weeks following Caylee's disappearance. Friends and acquaintances testified that Casey hadn't shown distress or panic. Instead, she had appeared at parties, laughing and socializing. This behavior was not what one would expect from a worried mother whose child was missing, and the prosecution used it to argue that Casey lacked the natural response of concern. They portrayed her as someone who felt no remorse or even sorrow for the loss of her child, emphasizing the peculiar ease with which she had resumed her daily life. In contrast, the defense fought to counter these portrayals, claiming that Casey's behavior was her way of shielding herself from the devastating circumstances. They asserted that Casey had been forced to grow up in a home where emotions were often suppressed, and that she had learned to hide her feelings as a survival mechanism. To bolster this claim, the defense brought in witnesses who had known Casey throughout her life. These individuals spoke about her tendency to withdraw emotionally, implying that her actions in the days following Caylee's disappearance were not an indication of indifference, but rather a reflection of learned behavior in response to a traumatic event. One of the most highly anticipated moments of the trial came when George Anthony, Casey's father, took the stand. The defense had suggested he played a role in covering up Caylee's passing, and now the prosecution aimed to disprove those allegations. George denied any involvement in a cover-up and tearfully recounted his love for his granddaughter, sharing memories that painted a portrait of a doting grandfather who could never harm her. When questioned about the defense's accusations, George vehemently denied them, maintaining his innocence. The prosecution used his testimony to try to discredit the defense's narrative and portray him as a grieving grandfather caught in a tragedy beyond his control. However, the defense continued to suggest that George's testimony was influenced by a desire to protect his own image. They implied that his actions following Caylee's disappearance were not those of a man grieving an accidental loss, but rather someone attempting to distance himself from guilt. They questioned him on details surrounding the events leading up to the last time Caylee was seen, hoping to create doubt around his version of events and hint at inconsistencies. Each moment of cross-examination heightened the tension in the courtroom, with both sides clashing over what each statement, each recollection, might truly imply. With tensions high, the trial reached one of its most critical moments, the presentation of Casey's jailhouse recordings. These recordings showed Casey interacting with her family during visits while in custody, and the prosecution highlighted moments where Casey seemed emotionally detached. She appeared concerned with her own situation, asking about bail and expressing frustration over her circumstances, but rarely mentioning Caylee. In the footage, Casey's responses and body language seemed disconnected from the gravity of the charges she faced, adding to the prosecution's argument that her focus was on herself rather than her child. The defense argued that these reactions were taken out of context, and that Casey was struggling with the fear of her impending trial. To counter the prosecution's portrayal, the defense brought in a psychologist who specialized in trauma. This expert testified that Casey's behavior in the recordings could be attributed to post-traumatic stress, arguing that her apparent detachment was a coping mechanism that had shielded her from fully processing her daughter's loss. They argued that Casey's responses should not be mistaken for a lack of care, but rather as part of a deeper emotional struggle that remained buried. The psychologist suggested that Casey had learned to mask her true feelings, especially in high-stress situations, offering a psychological explanation for her interactions during those jailhouse visits. As each side wrapped up its arguments, the jury was left to deliberate over a web of forensic data, psychological theories, and contrasting witness testimonies. They had heard hours of testimony and examined mountains of evidence, each piece contributing to an increasingly complex picture of what had happened to Caylee. The nation watched anxiously as the courtroom closed for deliberation, knowing the next phase would bring answers that everyone, friends, family, and the public, had been waiting for. The courtroom tension was palpable as the trial moved into the presentation of the most crucial testimonies. The prosecution leaned heavily on forensic experts to reinforce their theory, calling on specialists who could detail the forensic evidence they believed was connected to Caylee's last day. Experts in biochemistry, air samples, and decomposition testified about the traces found in Casey's trunk, pointing out the presence of chemicals associated with the decay of organic matter. According to their testimony, the levels and specific markers found in the car were consistent with human remains, and this evidence, though circumstantial, added a deeply unsettling layer to the prosecution's case. They also highlighted the strands of hair found in the trunk, explaining that microscopic analysis revealed the death banding characteristic of hair from someone who had passed away. These details left an impression on the jury, painting an image that aligned with the prosecution's theory. The defense, however, was quick to challenge the reliability of such forensic evidence, arguing that it was hardly conclusive proof. They brought in their own experts, who claimed that the science behind some of the prosecution's evidence was still evolving and in some cases controversial. The defense questioned the validity of using chemical compounds as indicators of decomposition, arguing that similar substances could be found in certain types of trash or even cleaning products. They asserted that any death banding found in the hair samples was inconclusive without DNA evidence to definitively match the hair to Caylee, leaving the jury with reasonable doubt about the scientific conclusions presented. Testimony from Casey's friends and acquaintances added further intrigue to the case. Many took the stand to describe Casey's actions and state of mind during the critical days following Caylee's disappearance. One friend recalled seeing Casey at a party, seemingly carefree, dancing and smiling without a trace of worry. Others described conversations where Casey either avoided mentioning Caylee altogether or offered vague statements that left them with uneasy suspicions. Prosecutors used these accounts to argue that Casey had acted without remorse or urgency. They described her as someone who, despite the gravity of her daughter's absence, continued to live as if nothing were wrong. The defense countered by reminding the court that appearances could be deceiving, suggesting that Casey's behavior was not proof of wrongdoing, but rather a means of compartmentalizing her emotions in a confusing and painful time. Another compelling moment arose when the prosecution introduced evidence from Casey's computer. They presented the jury with a record of search terms like how to make chloroform and methods of harm, searches that prosecutors argued indicated a dark and calculated intent. They also introduced evidence showing that these searches were conducted while Casey had access to the computer at her parents' home, framing her actions as premeditated. For the jury, these digital footprints seemed chilling, as if they offered a glimpse into Casey's thoughts before Caylee's disappearance. The defense, however, contested the interpretation of this computer evidence. They argued that these searches could have been conducted by someone else in the home, or that they were not as directly related to the case as the prosecution claimed. They questioned the accuracy of the timestamps and whether other users could have accessed the computer during the same period. Furthermore, the defense reminded the jury that no direct link had been made between these searches and the events surrounding Caylee, arguing that even if Casey had looked up these topics, it didn't necessarily prove harmful intent. With both sides wrestling over every shred of evidence, the trial's emotional weight grew heavier. Casey's parents, Cindy and George, sat through the testimonies in visible agony, their expressions shifting between sorrow, disbelief, and sometimes a painful neutrality as their daughter's fate unfolded in court. Cindy Anthony was called to testify about the hair samples, computer searches, and her relationship with Casey and Caylee. During her time on the stand, she tried to maintain composure, but the toll of the proceedings was evident. The defense questioned her thoroughly, hoping to plant seeds of doubt about the forensic findings. Cindy, a mother caught between loyalty to her daughter and grief for her granddaughter, became an emblem of the trial's complexity. George Anthony's testimony was equally intense. The defense had insinuated throughout the trial that he might have played a role in covering up Caylee's passing, portraying him as a manipulative presence in Casey's life. But George maintained his innocence, firmly denying any involvement in Caylee's disappearance and rejecting the defense's assertions. He spoke about his love for Caylee, reflecting on moments they shared and the joy she brought to his life. George's pain and frustration were palpable as he recounted these memories, but the defense continued to press him, aiming to expose inconsistencies in his story and create doubt around his version of events. As the testimonies concluded, the courtroom entered a state of somber anticipation. Both sides prepared to make their closing arguments, ready to reinforce their narratives one last time before the jury deliberated on the outcome. Each side had built a case based on meticulous details, conflicting expert analyses, and emotional testimonies. The jurors had the weight of countless hours of evidence upon them, each piece representing a fragment of the story that had unfolded, and now it would be their task to piece together a cohesive picture from the fragments left in the courtroom. With the trial now nearing its conclusion, the courtroom atmosphere was thick with anticipation. The prosecution began its closing arguments by methodically reconstructing the evidence, reminding the jury of the key points that, in their view, proved Caylee Anthony's involvement. They urged the jury to consider Casey's actions in the days following Caylee's disappearance, her misleading statements to the police, and her apparent attempts to mislead those around her. Each detail, the prosecution argued, pointed to a single conclusion: Caylee had been responsible for the loss of her daughter. Their presentation was concise but powerful, intended to leave a lasting impression of guilt. The defense, however, countered with its own interpretation. They argued that the prosecution's case was built on assumptions and circumstantial evidence, none of which could definitively tie Caylee to Caylee's passing. The defense attorney emphasized that the evidence was too weak, too indirect to justify such a grave conclusion. They pointed to the absence of definitive proof and reminded the jury that doubt, if reasonable, meant acquittal. They argued that a mother's grieving process could look different from what society expects, and that Caylee's behavior, while unusual, did not prove guilt. As the defense concluded, both sides had presented their final pleas, and the jury was tasked with a challenging decision. For hours, they deliberated, poring over the details of the case, revisiting the testimonies, and weighing the evidence with immense care. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, the world held its breath, waiting for the answer to a question that had captivated millions. Finally, the jury reached its decision. When the court reconvened, the foreperson rose to deliver the verdict. As the words, "not guilty," were spoken on the charge of taking Caylee's life, the courtroom erupted. There were gasps of shock, sounds of relief and expressions of disbelief. Caylee Anthony's reaction was measured. She showed little emotion as the rest of the charges were read, the courtroom buzzing with intense energy. The jury's verdict was clear. Caylee was acquitted of the most serious charges, convicted only on lesser counts of lying to law enforcement. The public reaction was swift and fierce. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered, some in support, but many expressing anger and disappointment. News stations across the country dissected every aspect of the trial, with commentators debating the justice system's verdict. For many, this was a story not just of one family, but of a society's struggle to reconcile legal standards with deep-seated emotions surrounding the case. In the aftermath of the trial, Caylee's life became a subject of media fascination. Her acquittal led to numerous interviews, but she remained largely out of the public eye. The Anthony family, too, faced the challenge of rebuilding their lives. Cindy and George Anthony continued to grapple with the immense loss of their granddaughter and the strain the trial had placed on their family. Despite the case's official closure, questions lingered. Caylee's story and the mystery surrounding her final days remained unresolved, leaving the public with theories, questions, and a narrative that still held a firm grip on the nation's attention. The next story is called the Caylee Anthony Mystery. It was mid-June 28 in Orlando, Florida, a time when families flocked to theme parks, pools, and the beaches. But for the Anthony family, an entirely different kind of summer had begun, one that would soon capture the attention of the entire country. It all started quietly, almost unnoticeably, with a peculiar absence. Little Caylee Marie Anthony, only 2 years old, seemed to vanish without a trace. Her grandmother, Cindy Anthony, was the first to notice something was wrong. It had been days, weeks even, since Cindy had last seen her granddaughter. Cindy's concerns grew each day that Caylee's mother, Casey, stayed away from home. Initially, Cindy tried to brush it off, telling herself that Casey, her 22-year-old daughter, was simply giving Caylee a little vacation. But as the days stretched on, Cindy felt a tightening knot in her stomach. On the surface, Casey appeared as if nothing were amiss, always managing to maintain her usual charm and calm, even as her parents' questions grew more pointed. Then came a day Cindy could no longer hold back. She confronted Casey, asking directly where Caylee was. Casey responded with a casual nonchalance, as if she were describing an ordinary day. "She's with a nanny," Casey said confidently. The nanny's name was Zenaida, and according to Casey, Zenaida, or Zanny, was someone she had trusted with Caylee many times. But something about Casey's calm didn't sit right with Cindy. It wasn't just the length of time Caylee had been absent, it was the way Casey seemed almost unfazed by her daughter's absence. Days turned into a few weeks, and Cindy's patience gave way to worry, which transformed into a consuming dread. She demanded answers, pressing Casey about the nanny's address, her contact information, and why no one else in the family had ever met Zanny. Casey, showing frustration, would tell her mother not to worry, promising that Caylee was safe. Yet, her answers remained vague. Cindy knew her daughter had a way with words, but now, those words felt like a wall between the truth and her mounting fear. It wasn't until mid-July that the facade began to crumble. Casey had left the family car parked in a garage for some time, and it caught Cindy's attention. When Cindy went to investigate, she immediately noticed a troubling smell, a smell that Cindy would later describe as unforgettable and impossible to ignore. Panicked, Cindy took a deep breath, pushed her emotions aside, and pressed Casey for the truth. At first, Casey tried to laugh it off, suggesting that it must have been a bag of trash left too long in the car. But Cindy knew something was deeply wrong. She decided she could no longer wait on her daughter's assurances. That was the day she called 911. In the recorded call, Cindy's voice quivers, reflecting a mixture of worry and confusion. She reported that her granddaughter had been missing for more than 30 days, a staggering admission. "There's something wrong. I found my daughter's car today, and it smells like there's been a dead body in the damn car," Cindy said, her voice breaking. The admission shocked the dispatcher, and within hours, officers were at the Anthony home, questioning Casey and trying to piece together the timeline of Caylee's disappearance. When Casey sat down with the police, her demeanor was strangely composed, even as she recounted a story that would have rattled most parents. She told investigators that on June 9th, she had dropped Caylee off with Zenaida at an apartment complex nearby. She said that she had gone back to pick her up later that day, but when she knocked, there was no answer. According to Casey, she had called Zenaida repeatedly, waited around, and even checked with the apartment's management, who confirmed that no one by that name lived there. Yet, Casey did not call the police. When investigators asked why she had waited more than a month to report Caylee missing, she gave an answer that only deepened the mystery. She said she was frightened and believed she could find Caylee herself. Somehow, despite weeks passing, Casey seemed almost detached from the terror most parents would feel in the same situation. As investigators listened to Casey's story, they sensed something was off. It wasn't just what Casey was saying, it was the way she was saying it, as though recounting an ordinary errand rather than a child's disappearance. Investigators decided they needed to follow up on Casey's claims about the nanny, Zenaida. They scoured records, checked apartments, and interviewed neighbors, but found no evidence that anyone by that name had ever met or cared for Caylee. The story Casey had woven began to unravel before their eyes. As days turned into weeks, the case against Casey became even more tangled. Officers found no signs of a struggle at the Anthony home, and no one could recall seeing Casey in a state of panic in the days or weeks after June 9th, the day she claimed Caylee was taken. To neighbors, Casey seemed remarkably calm, spending time with friends, attending parties, and even getting a tattoo with the words Bella Vita, Italian for beautiful life. Friends who saw her during that time noted she seemed happy, carefree, and most notably, unconcerned about any crisis involving her daughter. But forensics on the family car would soon turn this quiet mystery into a media firestorm. Crime scene investigators conducted a detailed analysis, and what they found was chilling. There were traces of decomposition in the trunk, and a hair sample matched Caylee's DNA. It was an alarming discovery, and it led authorities to intensify their focus on Casey. A fuller picture of Casey's activities emerged as investigators combed through phone records, credit card statements, and social media posts from the weeks Caylee was missing. Each piece of evidence seemed to contradict her story, casting doubt on her claims about Zenaida, about the day of June 9th, and about her desire to find Caylee herself. As the search for Caylee intensified, the Anthony family's home turned into a focal point for reporters, protesters, and people who had come to show their support or express outrage. The tragedy of a missing child struck a nerve across the nation, and everyone wanted answers. Why had Casey waited to report Caylee missing? Who was Zenaida, if she even existed? And what had really happened to little Caylee? The weeks stretched into months, and in December 2008, just when hope for finding Caylee had nearly faded, a discovery in a wooded area near the Anthony home provided a heartbreaking answer. For the investigators, the discovery in mid-December 2008 was both tragic and unsettling. Just a few streets away from the Anthony family home, hidden in a wooded lot, the skeletal remains of a young child were found inside a bag. Although authorities had suspected this was Caylee, they took no shortcuts. The remains were carefully retrieved and sent to forensic experts to confirm the identity. And soon enough, it was official. The remains were those of little Caylee Anthony. The news rippled through the Orlando community and beyond. Across the nation, people who had been following the case were left heartbroken, knowing this wasn't the outcome they'd hoped for. The Anthony family's nightmare had reached an undeniable and tragic reality. As for Casey Anthony, her situation grew increasingly serious. The forensic team scrutinized the evidence found near Caylee's remains, and what they uncovered added more questions than answers. Nearby, they found remnants of duct tape, positioned in a way that left a grim impression. A close examination of Caylee's skull revealed traces that led investigators to suspect the tape had been applied over her face. It was a disturbing implication, suggesting that whatever had happened to Caylee was more than a simple accident. While forensic specialists worked tirelessly, piecing together the evidence and studying the clues from the scene, law enforcement turned their attention back to Casey. This wasn't the behavior of a mother devastated by loss, some believe. Her actions over the past several months became a key focus as detectives pored over her interviews, noting every detail. They documented how she had carried herself, from her initial calm when questioned about Caylee to her involvement in social gatherings and her visible enjoyment of Orlando nightlife. Public scrutiny intensified when photos surfaced showing Casey attending parties, smiling broadly, and spending time with friends, all while Caylee was reportedly missing. It became harder to believe Casey's version of events. What kind of mother would attend parties and shop for herself during a time of such distress? These questions haunted the investigation and ignited public opinion against her. As the story took center stage in the media, investigators found themselves sorting through conflicting narratives and trying to distinguish fact from fiction. Among the many stories Caylee had told, her claim about a woman named Zenaida remained the most confounding. She had painted Zenaida as the nanny who had taken Caylee, yet there was no record of any interaction between them. Zenaida's existence became almost mythical, and each attempt to verify Caylee's story only led investigators further into dead ends. Caylee's own family grew increasingly perplexed. Cindy and George Anthony had hoped for answers, but each passing day only brought more frustration. They had supported their daughter, hoping to believe her account, yet they could not ignore the inconsistencies. Cindy, who had first sounded the alarm about Caylee's absence, felt a growing sense of disbelief as the case unraveled. The hope she had clung to, that this was all some terrible misunderstanding, became harder to hold onto with each new revelation. In the midst of all this, Caylee's legal team prepared for a trial that would captivate the world. Defense attorneys stepped forward with an unexpected claim, one that would change the entire course of the case. They alleged that Caylee's passing had been a tragic accident, one that had been covered up out of fear and panic rather than any premeditated harm. The defense painted a picture of a family dynamic that had pushed Caylee into a corner, died. They suggested that an accidental drowning in the Anthony family pool had set off a series of terrible decisions. Their narrative claimed that, panicked and unsure of what to do, Caylee and her father, George, had worked together to hide the truth, covering up the accident in a misguided attempt to protect their family's image. The claim shocked those in the courtroom and the public watching from afar. This was not only a defense, it was a direct accusation. The defense went so far as to imply that George had pressured Caylee to remain silent about the accident, painting him as a figure of fear in her life. George denied these accusations, his emotional testimony revealing the strain and heartbreak the family had endured. Yet, despite his denial, the defense's claims threw a new shadow over the case. For the prosecution, the task ahead seemed daunting, yet they remained confident in their case. They brought forth every piece of evidence they had gathered to contradict Caylee's new narrative. The forensic reports were damning. The duct tape, the signs of decomposition in the trunk of Caylee's car, and traces of chemicals associated with decomposition. Each piece of evidence pointed away from an accident and toward an intentional act. As the case unfolded, experts took the stand, presenting their findings with cold precision. A forensic specialist explained how specific chemicals were found in the car trunk, chemicals that could indicate biological breakdown. The experts made the case that these were not substances one would typically find without a troubling reason. But Caylee's defense team countered every claim. Why? They argued that these traces could have come from discarded items, trash bags, or even something as benign as a forgotten bag of groceries left in the heap. It was a courtroom battle like no other, with both sides presenting their arguments to a jury faced with the burden of finding truth amid conflicting evidence. As the days turned into weeks, the pressure grew. Media outlets documented every twist, every testimony, and every surprising development. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered, some holding signs calling for justice for Caylee, while others insisted on Caylee's innocence. The case had become a national phenomenon, one that exposed deep divides in public opinion and the legal system. Despite the defense's accusations and theories, the prosecution focused on Caylee's behavior as the strongest evidence of her guilt. They described how she had moved on with her life in the days after Caylee's disappearance, portraying her actions as those of someone unaffected by a loss. Each witness and each piece of evidence was intended to reveal Caylee's motivations, her attempts to cover her tracks, and the deliberate nature of her choices. Caylee's legal team, however, maintained that she was a victim of circumstance and family pressure. They argued that her actions, while seemingly unusual, were rooted in complex family issues and a deep-seated fear that had governed her life. They attempted to show that Caylee had been a young woman in a turbulent environment, forced to make impossible choices under the influence of powerful family dynamics. Throughout the trial, the tension inside the courtroom was palpable. Spectators held their breath as new witnesses took the stand, each adding more weight to a case that had already shattered hearts and stirred a nation. The fate of Caylee Anthony, and justice for Caylee hung in the balance, with each day bringing more questions and fewer clear answers. The trial progressed, revealing more shocking details with each passing day. And yet, amid all the legal wrangling, the heart of the case remained the same: what had truly happened to Caylee Anthony. The forensic analysis had painted a picture filled with dark possibilities, and now, the testimony of friends, family, and experts would attempt to bring that picture into focus. Among the most critical pieces of testimony came from the forensic experts who had examined the scene where Caylee's remains were found. Positioned near the discovery site was a blanket, one that investigators later determined matched bedding from the Anthony home. The prosecution argued that this blanket was significant, suggesting it had come from Caylee's room. For them, this detail strengthened the notion that someone close to Caylee was involved in her disappearance. The discovery of the duct tape near Caylee's remains also presented a troubling implication. Experts testified that the tape, found close to Caylee's skull, appeared to have been applied in a way that would have restricted her breathing. The prosecution used this finding to underscore the possibility of foul play, while Casey's defense team countered with the argument that any conclusions drawn from the condition of the tape were speculative at best. To them, the tape's placement could not definitively prove anything conclusive. In addition to the physical evidence, the prosecution called on forensic experts to explain what had been found in the Anthony family car. A specialist testified that traces of chloroform were detected in the trunk, suggesting that the chemical might have been used to render Caylee unconscious. The prosecution presented this as further evidence that Caylee's final moments had been controlled, planned, and calculated. But the defense countered this, arguing that there were many explanations for how such chemicals could have been detected. They even suggested that household cleaning products or environmental factors could have led to the readings obtained by the forensic team. Then came the examination of Casey's internet search history, which prosecutors argued revealed a disturbing focus on topics like chloroform and ways to make someone sleep. Prosecutors suggested that these searches were significant, indicating intent and preparation on Casey's part. In response, the defense team contended that Caylee was not the only person who used the computer in the Anthony household, implying that anyone could have conducted those searches. They highlighted the lack of evidence linking the search history directly to Caylee, casting doubt on the theory that she alone was responsible. As each new piece of forensic evidence was presented, the defense sought to dismantle the prosecution's case, piece by piece. They portrayed the prosecution's theory as speculative and rooted in emotional assumptions rather than hard facts. They insisted that there was no direct, incontrovertible evidence that tied Caylee to an act of deliberate harm against Caylee. For the defense, this was all circumstantial, a web of unfortunate coincidences woven into an unstable narrative. Beyond the forensic evidence, a series of friends and acquaintances took the stand, providing insight into Caylee's life in the weeks surrounding Caylee's disappearance. Several friends testified that Caylee had seemed normal, even carefree, during the time her daughter was missing. They recounted how she had attended parties, gone shopping, and socialized without any apparent distress. This behavior seemed at odds with the grief-stricken image of a parent dealing with the loss of a child, and the prosecution seized upon it as evidence of Caylee's detachment. They painted a picture of a young woman unburdened by her daughter's absence, a portrayal meant to emphasize Caylee's alleged indifference. The defense, however, argued that Caylee's outward calm did not necessarily mean she was responsible. They pointed to psychological factors and family dynamics, suggesting that Caylee's behavior was a complex coping mechanism rather than evidence of guilt. To support this argument, they introduced a mental health expert who testified that people handle trauma in different ways. The expert explained that some individuals may even go to great lengths to mask their feelings, behaving outwardly as if nothing is wrong to avoid facing painful emotions. Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, public opinion continued to intensify. Supporters and detractors alike gathered, with some holding signs calling for justice for Caylee, while others expressed support for Caylee, claiming she was innocent. The case had struck a chord with people across the country, drawing them into the courtroom drama as though they, too, were part of the jury. News stations ran continuous coverage, analyzing every new piece of testimony, every twist and turn, further fueling the emotional investment of viewers. Yet, as the trial stretched on, there were moments when the prosecution's arguments began to seem less certain. Despite their best efforts to create a coherent narrative of what had happened, the evidence remained largely circumstantial. Forensic analysis could suggest theories, but it could not definitively answer the one question on everyone's mind: how had Caylee lost her life? To address this gap, the prosecution called a pathologist who had examined Caylee's remains. This expert testified that, due to the state of decomposition, it was impossible to determine the exact cause of passing. The pathologist explained that while certain conclusions could be drawn from the positioning of the tape and other clues, a specific cause remained elusive. This limitation in the evidence left the prosecution with a challenge. They had been able to show that Caylee's passing involved disturbing circumstances, but proving beyond a reasonable doubt that Casey was responsible required more. As the trial wore on, emotions continued to run high. The stakes of the case had grown beyond just the fate of one individual. For many, it had come to represent a broader search for truth and justice. The family dynamics within the Anthony household were scrutinized from every angle, with experts offering opinions on the complex relationships among Casey, her parents, and her brother. Some witnesses painted a picture of a family haunted by secrets, while others suggested a more ordinary, if complicated, family life. Casey's demeanor in the courtroom only heightened the intrigue. At times, she appeared composed, seemingly indifferent to the proceedings. But on certain days, when testimony grew especially intense, her emotions showed through moments of sadness, frustration, even anger. This fluctuation in her behavior fueled speculation about her role in Caylee's passing. Was her demeanor that of an innocent mother accused of a terrible crime? Or was it the mask of someone hiding the truth? The defense continued to build upon their theory of an accidental tragedy covered up in fear. They called additional witnesses who spoke to Casey's relationship with her father, George, and offered accounts meant to support the idea that the family was under immense pressure. Through cross-examination, they aimed to show that Casey's actions, however unorthodox, were rooted in complex family issues and not malice. Yet, as the final pieces of evidence were presented, the jury faced an immense task. The forensic clues, the testimonies, the psychological evaluations, all combined into a complicated tapestry that demanded interpretation. The truth remained elusive, concealed beneath layers of conflicting evidence and contrasting narratives. And as the trial neared its conclusion, the weight of those unanswered questions lingered heavily in the air, preparing the stage for the intense final days of this high-profile case. The trial had reached its most crucial stage, with both sides preparing to make their final cases. The prosecution had built a narrative that portrayed Casey as a young mother who had chosen freedom over responsibility. The defense, meanwhile, insisted on the theory of a tragic accident compounded by family secrets. With so much at stake, the closing days of testimony promised to be the most intense yet, as each side sought to sway the jury and deliver a decisive interpretation of Caylee's fate. The prosecution began its final push by highlighting Casey's behavior in the days following Caylee's disappearance. They presented video footage, photos, and testimonies from friends, portraying Casey as someone who appeared unaffected by her daughter's absence. A series of witnesses recounted seeing Casey out with friends, attending parties, and even shopping without any signs of concern or distress. This portrayal of her social life became a powerful tool in the prosecution's case. They argued that her actions were inconsistent with those of a parent grieving a loss, painting her as someone who had moved on without regard for her daughter. But the defense countered by presenting their own witnesses, friends and family members who spoke to Casey's struggles and the pressures she had faced as a young mother. They suggested that her behavior, though unconventional, was not an indication of wrongdoing. Mental health experts were brought in to explain how individuals sometimes cope with trauma by distracting themselves, even engaging in activities that seem out of character, as a way to avoid confronting painful emotion. The defense continued to insist that Casey's behavior was complex, and that outward appearances did not necessarily indicate guilt. As the prosecution's case continued, they called forensic experts back to the stand to reinforce key pieces of evidence. The traces of chloroform in Casey's car were once again emphasized, with the prosecution arguing that this was a deliberate choice, a calculated measure meant to control Caylee's movements. The presence of chloroform suggested intent, they argued, pointing to internet searches on the Anthony family computer as further proof. The prosecution painted this as a premeditated plan, an act of careful planning and execution. The defense team responded with their own theory regarding the presence of chloroform. They argued that environmental factors, cleaning products, or even the remnants of household chemicals could explain the trace findings in the car. To the defense, the prosecution's reliance on such evidence was an overreach, a speculative leap without a clear foundation. They questioned the accuracy of the forensic testing, suggesting that the methods used to detect chloroform might have been flawed or misinterpreted. Next, the prosecution turned to one of the most emotionally charged pieces of evidence, the duct tape found near Caylee's remains. They argued that the presence and positioning of the tape were intentional, designed to ensure that Caylee could not call for help. It was a difficult image for the jury to confront, and the prosecution used it to reinforce their theory that Caylee's passing was not accidental. They described the tape as a symbol of control, presenting it as one of the most damning pieces of evidence in their case. But the defense responded by challenging the reliability of the duct tape evidence. They argued that the tape's positioning was not definitive proof of anything, given the natural shifts and movement that could have occurred over time. They questioned whether the tape had actually been placed by anyone with intent, or if it was a tragic coincidence in a heartbreaking scene. They urged the jury to consider that the prosecution was asking them to draw conclusions based on assumptions rather than facts. As the case neared its conclusion, the defense introduced a series of character witnesses. These individuals testified about Casey's relationship with Caylee, describing her as a loving and attentive mother. They spoke about the bond the two shared, recalling fond memories of Caylee and Casey's interactions. The defense argued that Casey's love for her daughter was genuine and deep, and that she would never willingly bring harm to Caylee. They insisted that what had happened was a devastating accident, a tragedy that had spiraled out of control due to family pressure and fear. The prosecution, however, was unrelenting. They argued that actions speak louder than words and that Casey's behavior in the aftermath of Caylee's disappearance was proof enough of her intentions. They reminded the jury of the social outings, the parties, and the carefree behavior that painted a starkly different picture from that of a grieving mother. To the prosecution, these actions were not the hallmarks of innocence. They were, instead, clear indicators of guilt. In their closing arguments, the prosecution painted a vivid picture of a young woman who had felt trapped by the responsibilities of parenthood. They argued that Casey had wanted a way out, and that she had gone to unimaginable lengths to create a life without Caylee. The prosecution urged the jury to remember Caylee's life, to consider the evidence, and to deliver a verdict that would bring justice to the little girl who could no longer speak for herself. The defense, in their own closing argument, appealed to the jury's sense of compassion. They reminded the jurors of the complex family dynamics at play, suggesting that Casey's behavior was influenced by emotional turmoil, fear, and a desperate need for acceptance. They argued that the prosecution's case was built on circumstantial evidence, on assumptions, and speculation. They urged the jury to consider the possibility of doubt, to look beyond appearances and question the prosecution's conclusions. As the trial concluded and the jury left to deliberate, the nation held its breath. News outlets covered every moment, waiting for the decision that would either condemn or exonerate Caylee. Public opinion was divided. Some believed in her innocence, while others were certain of her guilt. The case had become a reflection of broader social questions about family, responsibility, and justice, drawing viewers from across the world who sought answers to a heartbreaking mystery. The deliberations stretched on, with the jury painstakingly reviewing each piece of evidence, each testimony, and each argument presented over the course of the trial. The responsibility placed upon them was immense, and they knew the gravity of their decision would impact not only Caylee and her family, but also the public's faith in the justice system. The courtroom was filled with a tense silence as the jury filed back in after days of deliberation. Each juror's face was serious, reflecting the weight of their decision. The public had waited anxiously, and now, as everyone held their breath, the verdict would finally be revealed. As the judge addressed the courtroom, he reminded everyone of the importance of maintaining decorum. He turned to the jury foreperson, who stood and announced their findings. On the charge of first-degree wrongdoing, the jury found Caylee Anthony not guilty. The room erupted, a mixture of gasps and murmurs filling the air as the verdict settled over the crowd. People inside and outside the courthouse were stunned, as the verdict contradicted the expectations of many. Outside, crowds gathered and a mix of emotions spilled over into the streets. Some people were relieved, viewing the verdict as a sign that the system had worked as it should. Others were outraged, struggling to reconcile the evidence they had seen with the decision that had been handed down. To them, the idea that there would be no legal consequences in this case was deeply unsettling. Across social media and news outlets, people debated the verdict, discussing every aspect of the trial that had captivated the nation. Inside the courtroom, Casey's face was a mixture of relief and emotion as she realized she was free from the most serious charges. Yet, her release didn't mean she was entirely without accountability. The jury found her guilty of 4 misdemeanor counts related to misleading law enforcement during the investigation. For each of these charges, Casey would face sentencing. Though the sentences were relatively short, they underscored the impact of her actions on the investigation. The Anthony family, too, faced their own struggles in the aftermath of the trial. George and Cindy Anthony had been thrust into the public eye, their family's private struggles broadcast to the world. For them, the trial had been a deeply painful experience, one that revealed tensions and rifts within their family. Cindy, who had initially defended Casey, now faced an uncertain relationship with her daughter. George, accused by the defense of covering up an accident, had to contend with the lasting impact of those allegations on his own reputation. As the media continued to cover the fallout, the story became more than just a legal case. It became a societal debate. Discussions on parenting, accountability, and family dynamics emerged, each adding a layer to the public's reaction to the verdict. Commentators debated whether justice had been served and what the case revealed about the criminal justice system. Some argued that the case had set a troubling precedent, while others saw it as a necessary reminder of the principle of reasonable doubt. In the months that followed, Casey attempted to rebuild her life out of the public eye. Her acquittal had granted her freedom, but it came at a steep cost. For many, she would always be associated with the case, and moving forward without the weight of public scrutiny seemed unlikely. Job prospects were slim, her friendships had changed, and trust from her family was strained, if not broken. The support she had once received from her parents had shifted, now complicated by the strain of accusations that had been leveled during the trial. But beyond the courtroom drama, the memory of Caylee remained the story's true heart. In Orlando, a quiet memorial was set up by community members to honor her, a simple reminder of the young life that had captured the hearts of so many. Flowers, stuffed animals, and candles were left in her memory as people from all walks of life came together to pay their respects. Her image became a symbol for many, a reminder of the vulnerability of children and the importance of community vigilance. In time, the Anthony case became one of the most studied and analyzed trials of the era, sparking books, documentaries, and continued debate. Legal scholars examined the trial as a landmark case, one that tested the bounds of forensic evidence and public perception in the courtroom. The use of circumstantial evidence, digital forensics, and psychological testimony all played roles in the trial's outcome, making it a case that would be referenced for years to come. Despite the intense media coverage and public outcry, the truth of what had happened to Caylee remained elusive. The theories, the evidence, and the questions raised during the trial lingered, casting a shadow over the case. For many, the verdict was a stark reminder of the limitations of the legal system. While it could examine evidence and make judgments, it could not always provide the closure that people yearned for. As the years went by, the questions around the case never fully disappeared. The Anthony family story became a cautionary tale, discussed in classrooms, legal seminars, and on media platforms around the world. Casey's name remained synonymous with the controversy, and Caylee's memory served as a reminder of both the preciousness of life and the importance of accountability. In the end, the story of Caylee Anthony left a lasting impact on the public consciousness. It raised questions that still echo today, about the nature of truth, the burden of proof, and the deep complexities of family bonds. For the people who had followed the case from its beginning, Caylee's memory would remain in their hearts, a lasting legacy that transcended the courtroom and touched countless lives. The next and final story is called Scott Peterson's Conviction. On the morning of December 24, 2002, the small, quiet town of Modesto, California, awoke to the chilling news of a missing person, a pregnant woman named Laci Peterson. It was Christmas Eve, a time when families came together to celebrate, but at the Peterson household, a cloud of uncertainty and fear hung heavily. Scott Peterson, Laci's husband, had called the police, reporting that his wife was nowhere to be found. He explained to officers that he had returned home from a fishing trip, only to discover that Laci wasn't there. She had been walking their golden retriever, Mackenzie, earlier that morning, he said, but no one had seen her since. As officers arrived to take Scott's statement, they couldn't ignore the subtle signs of something amiss. They observed Scott, calm, perhaps too calm for a man whose wife, 8 months pregnant, was missing. His demeanor didn't align with the situation, a small detail that would haunt investigators in the days to come. Nevertheless, as any missing person case begins, the police treated Scott as the worried husband he claimed to be, focusing their efforts on finding Laci. The community quickly rallied, launching an extensive search across Modesto and the surrounding areas. Flyers with Laci's smiling face flooded neighborhoods. News stations broadcast her picture, and volunteers poured into the streets, combing fields and checking every corner. The image of Laci's hopeful smile on those posters stirred hearts, leaving no one untouched by the urgency of the search. But as the days stretched on, the suspicions surrounding Scott began to deepen. Investigators noted a puzzling lack of emotion. When his wife and unborn child were the focus of a desperate search, Scott seemed distant. He cooperated with authorities, but appeared disengaged, as though watching events unfold from a distance rather than participating in them. It was a behavior that investigators couldn't ignore, and the press picked up on it quickly. The media soon became an unstoppable force in the case, dissecting every detail of Scott's behavior and scrutinizing his every word. As the cameras rolled, Scott maintained his calm exterior, even as the nation watched with a mix of fascination and suspicion. Yet, beneath the surface, things were more complicated. The case's first big break came in early January, when Amber Frey, a massage therapist from Fresno, came forward with shocking information. Amber revealed to the police that she had been dating Scott, and in their time together, he had painted himself as a man without ties. He had told her he was single, with no obligations or family. To her horror, she had no idea that the man she was seeing was not only married, but that his wife was missing and their unborn child at risk. Amber's revelation struck like a lightning bolt. Public trust in Scott, already fragile, began to unravel completely. Police launched an intensive investigation, working to piece together the web of deception Scott had woven. Through phone records, wiretaps, and endless interviews, they began to unravel his version of events. Every moment Amber had spent with Scott became evidence, each lie he had told her another brick in the case the police were building. Scott's calm demeanor and calculated distance now appeared not as symptoms of shock, but of something darker. Investigators began to suspect that he had planned to start a new life, a life without Laci and the responsibilities of fatherhood. Forensic teams scoured the Peterson home, looking for signs of a struggle or any indication that might reveal Laci's whereabouts. As they continued their work, their suspicions grew. Scott's alibi, the fishing trip, seemed too coincidental and his behavior increasingly concerning. They started to question if Scott's fishing trip had been more than a leisurely outing on Christmas Eve morning. Months passed with no sign of Laci. The community held vigils, lighting candles, and praying for her safe return. But with each passing day, hope began to wane, and whispers turned into angry murmurs. Many in the community had come to their own conclusions, and Scott's place at those vigils only amplified the public's anger. He was the husband, the man who should have been devastated, pleading for his wife's return. But in those moments, he wore an unflinching expression, one that many couldn't understand. It was as though he had already said his goodbye to Laci. Then, on April 13, 2003, the mystery took a dark and tragic turn. The remains of a woman and an infant were found along the shoreline of the San Francisco Bay, near the very spot Scott had gone fishing. The bodies, badly decomposed from months in the water, were identified as Laci and her unborn child. The community's worst fears were realized. The news broke the hearts of everyone who had hoped for a miracle. It was a day of mourning, one that cast a shadow over Modesto and rippled across the nation. With this grim discovery, the focus shifted from a missing person case to something far more sinister: the murder of a young mother and her unborn child. Scott's behavior was re-examined, and the investigation intensified. With the bodies found near the exact location Scott had claimed to be on the morning of her disappearance, the case against him grew stronger. Detectives zeroed in, scrutinizing every alibi, every inconsistency. And as the truth began to come to light, Scott Peterson, The husband, who had once claimed to be as shattered as the community, was now the prime suspect in his wife's death. The discovery of Laci and her unborn child's bodies devastated the Modesto community. With the evidence now sharply pointing in one direction, investigators focused their efforts with renewed intensity on Scott Peterson. Everything about his story, the fishing trip on Christmas Eve, the calmness he displayed during Laci's disappearance, and now the proximity of her remains to his alibi location, was re-examined under a microscope. Each piece of evidence began to fit together in a chilling puzzle, and the authorities were determined to ensure justice for Laci and her child. Investigators wasted no time in obtaining a search warrant to revisit Scott's home and car. They looked over every inch of his life, gathering hair samples, carpet fibers, and searching for any trace evidence that could link him to the disappearance. The forensic analysis became more intense with each new detail uncovered. Among the growing pile of evidence, authorities found cement residue in Scott's boat that could have been used to make homemade anchors, an unsettling detail that raised further questions about his fishing trip. With the physical evidence building up, detectives worked to bolster their case through witness testimony and Scott's past actions. Amber Frey's statement proved to be invaluable, as she agreed to cooperate fully with the investigation. She had recorded many of her conversations with Scott, conversations where he revealed a side of himself completely at odds with his public persona. These tapes became powerful pieces of evidence. On them, Scott could be heard talking to Amber just days after Laci disappeared, describing himself as a grieving single man navigating a personal tragedy. He admitted to having lost his wife, words that painted him as a man more focused on his own narrative than on the life of his missing wife. As the case gained national attention, Scott's seemingly callous behavior shocked the public. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse and his home, chanting and holding signs demanding justice for Laci. News anchors and journalists across the country reported on the case, and every update gripped viewers who tuned in daily. Scott's life was unfolding under a harsh spotlight, and every word he said, every action he took, was scrutinized. The media coverage played a significant role in shaping public opinion, casting Scott as a man whose actions lacked empathy and integrity, adding to the weight of evidence piling up against him. Soon, a critical moment arrived in the investigation. Detectives learned from Laci's friends and family that Scott had shown no interest in preparing for the birth of their child, unusual behavior for a soon-to-be father. Unlike most expectant parents, he hadn't joined Laci in setting up a nursery or shown much excitement about their baby. In fact, when questioned, he seemed more detached than ever, as though he were preparing for a different future altogether, one that didn't include his wife and child. This information painted a disturbing picture of his intentions, reinforcing suspicions that Scott may have planned to start anew without them. But perhaps the most damning evidence emerged from forensic analysis of Scott's boat, the same boat he claimed to have used during his alibi fishing trip. Forensic experts concluded that it was highly likely Scott had been on the bay the day Laci went missing. The area where Laci and her child were found was near where Scott had said he'd been fishing, and investigators couldn't ignore the implications. With this connection, the theory took shape. Scott had taken Laci out to the water and left her there, a horrifying betrayal that sent shockwaves through those following the case. The Modesto Police Department was now ready to make their move. On April 18, 2003, Scott was arrested near Loyola, California. At the time, he had significantly altered his appearance. His normally dark hair was now bleached blonde, and he had grown a goatee. In his car, officers found items that hinted at the possibility of a planned escape: several $1,000s in cash, 4 cell phones, camping equipment, and his brother's identification. This led investigators to believe that Scott may have intended to flee to Mexico, a detail that only furthered suspicions about his guilt. This attempt to evade law enforcement, coupled with the mounting physical evidence, solidified the decision to bring him to trial. The arrest marked a turning point in the case, one that brought both sorrow and relief to Laci's family. Her loved ones, who had prayed for her safe return, were now coming to terms with a painful reality, finding some solace in the hope that justice would be served. The community that had rallied behind the search for Laci now stood united in their call for accountability. The legal process was about to unfold, and Scott's trial would soon begin, setting the stage for one of the most sensational courtroom dramas of the decade. The trial of Scott Peterson officially began in June 2004, drawing intense media attention as spectators, journalists, and onlookers filled the courthouse and surrounded its steps. Each day, lines of people gathered outside, hoping to catch a glimpse of the accused husband, the defense team, or even Laci's family. This case had captivated the country, and the courtroom became a stage where the unfolding drama of justice and tragedy drew everyone in. The prosecution began by presenting a powerful opening statement, painting Scott Peterson as a man who was seeking freedom from his responsibilities as a husband and soon-to-be father. They argued that, to start his life anew, Scott had made the calculated decision to remove those closest to him. According to the prosecution, this was not a crime of impulse but a deliberate plan, one that Scott had carefully considered and carried out. They presented the jury with the evidence they'd collected, the conversations between Scott and Amber, the forensic discoveries, and the strange way Scott seemed emotionally detached during Laci's disappearance. To strengthen their case, the prosecution called Amber Frey to the stand. Her testimony was one of the most anticipated parts of the trial, and she arrived ready to help the court understand the man Scott had shown himself to be behind closed doors. Amber described how Scott had painted a picture of himself as a single man, free from family obligations. She shared their taped conversations, each one revealing a side of Scott that stood in stark contrast to his public persona. In one of the most haunting revelations, she recounted Scott telling her, just days before Laci's disappearance, that he had lost his wife. This chilling statement suggested to the jury that Scott had been preparing Amber for a future with him, a future without Laci. Her words echoed through the courtroom, leaving a lasting impression on everyone present. The prosecution continued by bringing forward forensic experts, who walked the jury through the findings from Scott's boat and car. Experts testified that Scott had purchased a small boat only a month before Laci went missing, a purchase he hadn't mentioned to anyone, not even Laci. In the same time frame, he had bought concrete, which investigators suspected he used to make homemade weights. Forensic scientists detailed how trace evidence from the boat and his fishing trip further indicated that Scott had been near the area in the bay where Laci's remains were eventually found. Each expert added another layer to the story the prosecution was building, one that depicted Scott as a man who had carefully plotted an escape from his current life. The defense, however, presented their own narrative. They claimed that Scott had loved Laci deeply and had been devastated by her loss. According to them, his decision to act calmly and cooperatively with law enforcement was simply his way of handling an unbearable situation. They argued that Scott's behavior might appear strange to others, but it wasn't proof of guilt. They questioned the integrity of the investigation, suggesting that the police were so focused on Scott that they overlooked other possible explanations and suspects. The defense attempted to paint Scott as an unlucky man who had been unfairly vilified by a biased public and a relentless media. Throughout the trial, the defense team aimed to weaken the credibility of the prosecution's timeline and forensic evidence. They argued that no eyewitnesses had seen Scott commit any act of harm, and they highlighted potential issues with how certain evidence was handled. They argued that the lack of a clear motive weakened the prosecution's case, asserting that Scott had no reason to endanger his family. However, the prosecution's narrative grew even stronger when they presented evidence from Scott's wiretapped phone calls after Laci's disappearance. The jury heard Scott's conversations with friends, family, and Amber, and his words betrayed an unsettling detachment from the gravity of the situation. Some conversations included casual mentions of his whereabouts, with Scott even discussing mundane details, as if his wife hadn't just vanished. The contrast between his apparent concern in public and his detached phone conversations worked against him, reinforcing the prosecution's argument that he had been preparing for a life beyond his marriage. As the trial progressed, both the prosecution and defense battled to sway the jury, with each side challenging the evidence presented by the other. Each piece of evidence and testimony became a chess piece in a complex legal game as attorneys scrutinized every detail. The defense continued to portray Scott as a victim of circumstance, even calling in character witnesses to affirm that he was a kind and responsible individual who couldn't have committed such a crime. But for the prosecution, the final blow came through the timeline they constructed, detailing Scott's movements on the day Laci disappeared. Through expert testimonies and witness statements, they walked the jury through each of Scott's actions, connecting him to the suspicious events and leading up to the moment when Laci's remains were discovered. The weight of this evidence painted a picture that was difficult to ignore, one that depicted Scott not as a grieving husband, but as a man who had made the decision to free himself from his family. In the end, as both sides presented their closing arguments, the prosecution urged the jury to remember the people at the center of this tragedy, Laci and her unborn child. They argued that Scott's actions were not those of an innocent man caught in a tragic situation, but of someone who saw his family as obstacles to his freedom. The defense, on the other hand, maintained that Scott's odd behavior and choices were not proof of his guilt, asking the jury to separate his actions from the devastating reality of Laci's fate. As the jury prepared to deliberate, the courtroom grew tense, with everyone awaiting the verdict that would determine the fate of Scott Peterson. In November 2004, after months of intense trial proceedings and public anticipation, the jury reached a verdict in the case against Scott Peterson. Reporters and bystanders gathered outside the courthouse as word spread that the jury was ready to announce its decision. The courtroom was filled with an anxious energy as Scott stood to hear his fate. The foreperson rose and with a clear voice delivered the verdict: guilty of first-degree harm against Laci and second-degree harm against their unborn son. The words hung in the air, marking the culmination of a case that had gripped the nation. The verdict sent waves of emotion through the room. Family members of Laci, overcome with relief and sorrow, held each other close, finding solace in the long-sought justice. Meanwhile, Scott stood motionless, his expression unreadable. Outside the courthouse, the gathered crowd reacted with mixed emotions, though many had come to see justice served for Laci and her child. But the case was far from over. With a guilty verdict reached, the trial moved into the sentencing phase, where the same jury would determine whether Scott should face the death penalty or life in prison without the possibility of parole. The atmosphere in the courtroom remained tense as both the prosecution and defense presented their final arguments. The prosecution urged the jury to consider the loss that Laci's family had endured and the evidence pointing to a calculated act. They argued that Scott had planned this tragedy with a chilling calmness, asking the jury to deliver the most severe punishment under the law. The defense, however, presented an argument focused on Scott's life and character, insisting that, despite the verdict, Scott's actions did not justify the ultimate punishment. They called on witnesses who described Scott's positive qualities, his role in his family, and the lives he had touched in his community. They painted a picture of a man who had made mistakes, but did not deserve to pay the ultimate price. The defense asked the jury to show mercy, urging them to spare Scott's life, and to consider the impact his absence would have on those who still cared for him. After several days of emotional and powerful testimony from both sides, the jury retired to deliberate on Scott's sentence. And just as before, the anticipation outside the courthouse grew with each passing hour. People gathered once again, their eyes fixed on the courthouse doors, waiting for news. Finally, the jury returned with their decision. They recommended the death penalty, a sentence that underscored the gravity of Scott's actions and the impact they had left on Laci's family and the wider community. The judge accepted the jury's recommendation, and Scott Peterson was formally sentenced to death in March 2005. As the sentence was handed down, the reaction in the courtroom was a mix of relief and closure, though the grief was still palpable. For Laci's family, this moment offered a measure of justice, yet it couldn't erase the pain of their loss. In the days following the sentencing, many shared memories of Laci, remembering her as a loving daughter, a caring friend, and a woman whose life had been filled with joy and promise. Outside the courthouse, the public response was intense. Some supported the sentence, viewing it as a fitting end to the tragic saga, while others questioned whether justice could truly be achieved. The case had sparked national conversations about family, trust, and justice, and it continued to echo in homes and headlines across the country. But the sentence did not mean the case was entirely closed. Scott's defense team immediately began working on an appeal, arguing that the trial had been compromised by media influence and potential juror bias. They contended that Scott's case had been unfairly impacted by the extensive public attention it received and the pervasive media coverage that followed every twist and turn. They questioned whether he had received a fair trial, raising issues about whether pretrial publicity had tainted the jury pool and whether the intense scrutiny had influenced the outcome. In the years that followed, Scott's legal team filed multiple appeals, each one attempt to challenge the original trial's outcome and sentence. They argued over procedural matters, the handling of evidence, and jury selection, claiming that Scott's right to a fair trial had been compromised. The appeals process became a complex and prolonged chapter in the case, with each new legal motion bringing a renewed focus on the events surrounding Laci's death. In the years following Scott Peterson's sentencing, his case remained firmly in the public eye. His legal team, unrelenting in their pursuit of appeals, filed motion after motion, arguing that Scott had been denied a fair trial due to widespread media coverage and potential bias among jurors. They contended that the intensity of public interest had transformed Scott's trial into a spectacle, one that they claimed had overshadowed the principles of impartial justice. These appeals gradually worked their way through California's courts, each raising questions about the power of media influence and the justice system's vulnerability to public opinion. In 2020, a significant development took place. The California Supreme Court overturned Scott's death sentence, a decision that sparked renewed public debate and intense interest in the case once again. While the court upheld his conviction for the harm of Laci and their unborn child, it concluded that errors in the jury selection process warranted a re-evaluation of his sentence. Specifically, the court found that some potential jurors had been improperly dismissed during the original trial, which could have affected the outcome. This decision to reverse the death sentence was a moment of relief for Scott's defense team and sparked discussions nationwide about fairness, particularly in high-profile cases. The ruling sent shockwaves through the community and rekindled feelings among those who had followed the case closely. For Laci's family, who had endured years of pain and uncertainty, the decision was deeply unsettling. They had lived through years of legal battles, only to learn that Scott's death sentence would be taken off the table. The legal system, which they had relied upon for closure, was now reopening the wounds of their loss. Yet, despite the disappointment, Laci's family remained committed to ensuring that Scott would serve life in prison without the possibility of parole. They continued to attend hearings and make public statements, determined to keep Laci's memory alive and to see that Scott remained behind bars. As Scott's legal team prepared for a new sentencing hearing, the public interest in the case was rekindled, and discussions about Scott's potential future outside of prison intensified. Supporters of the death penalty argued that Scott's actions warranted the original sentence, while others pointed to the flaws in the initial trial as evidence of a need for reform in the justice system. The reversal of Scott's death sentence became part of a broader dialogue in California, where debates over the death penalty, sentencing reforms, and the rights of the accused were gaining momentum. Meanwhile, Scott's case continued to attract attention from true crime enthusiasts, investigative journalists, and documentary filmmakers. Over time, various television specials, podcasts, and documentaries dissected the details of the case, examining every angle and revisiting the moments that had captured the nation's attention years earlier. Some programs questioned aspects of the investigation, while others focused on Scott's behavior and the forensic evidence. Each new analysis reignited discussions among the public, with some people re-evaluating their views on his guilt or innocence. These productions served as a reminder of how deeply Scott Peterson's case had become embedded in the cultural memory of the nation. Throughout this period, Scott remained in prison, adapting to life behind bars as the years stretched on. He faced the reality of a life spent largely in isolation, separated from the outside world and the people he once knew. For many, the life sentence without parole was viewed as a fitting outcome for someone convicted of such a grave offense. However, Scott's defense team continued to explore legal avenues, determined to uncover any possibility for an appeal that might reduce his sentence further. While Scott's future remained in legal limbo, the story of Laci and her unborn child continued to resonate, particularly among those who remembered the early days of the case. For many, this case became a catalyst for reflection on issues of trust, betrayal, and the complexities of human relationships. The memory of Laci Peterson lived on, symbolizing the loss experienced by a family and a community that had sought justice for nearly 2 decades. In the end, Scott Peterson's case stands as one of the most defining moments in true crime history, serving as a reminder of the far-reaching impacts of loss and the lengths to which families and communities will go in their pursuit of justice. The case remains a somber chapter in legal history, underscoring the complex intersection of media, justice, and the lasting human need for answers. For the Peterson family, the hope remains that Laci's memory will endure far beyond the walls of any courtroom or the pages of any legal document. It is her life, after all, that continues to remind us of the profound value of love, family, and the shared bonds that connect us all. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the darkest true crime stories. If you enjoyed today's tales, don't forget to hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your engagement helps keep our community thriving. Make sure to subscribe to Chill Thrills Stories and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. We bring you the most gripping true crime stories every week. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.